There is something happening beneath the surface of what you've been calling reality, not at the edges of it, not in some distant corner of the cosmos where strange things are permitted to exist. Beneath it, beneath the version you were handed when you were young enough to accept it without question, beneath the explanation that was given to you as final, beneath the story that said, "This is what the world is. This is how it works. This is the limit of what's real." That surface is cracking. And what's cracking through isn't something new. It isn't something that just arrived. What's cracking through is what has always been there, beneath every layer you've been shown, beneath every explanation you were given, beneath every version of reality that was presented to you as complete. What you're feeling right now, that sense that something is shifting, that the world you knew feels slightly less solid than it used to, that some understanding you've carried for years is starting to show its edges. That feeling isn't confusion. It isn't instability. It isn't you coming apart. It is your consciousness beginning to penetrate the veil. And the veil is not what most people think it is. It isn't a mystical curtain drawn by cosmic forces. It isn't a conspiracy of suppression. It is something far more precise than that, and far more interesting. The veil is a limitation of the layer you've been observing from. It is what happens when awareness is tuned to a single frequency and mistakes that frequency for the totality of what exists. Today, we change the frequency. Today we go beneath the surface version of reality that has been accepted as final, and we reveal what's underneath it, layer by layer, with precision, with the kind of evidence that doesn't ask you to believe anything, because it shows you what's already there, waiting to be seen. What you're about to discover has been hidden in plain sight. Not hidden by anyone in particular. Hidden by the layer itself. Hidden because the surface of reality is extraordinarily convincing, and because most of the people who could have shown you what was underneath it stopped at the surface explanation and called it complete. They weren't wrong about the surface. They were just wrong that the surface was everything. There is always a layer beneath that. And this is where we begin. Let's start with what you think you know about reality, not to dismiss it, not to tell you it was all wrong, but to establish the surface precisely, because you cannot lift a veil you haven't clearly seen. The surface version of reality goes something like this. The world is made of matter. Matter is made of atoms. Atoms are solid, stable, fundamental building blocks of everything you can touch, see, measure, and interact with. Your body is made of them. The chair you're sitting on is made of them. The air around you is made of them. Reality, at its foundation, is physical. It is material. It is solid. And while there is much we don't yet understand, the basic architecture is settled. Matter exists. Space contains it. Time moves through it. And you, as a conscious observer, are a product of that material process. A sophisticated arrangement of atoms that somehow became aware of itself. That is the surface version. And for most of human history, it felt complete. It felt like bedrock. But there's a layer beneath that. And the moment you see it, the surface version doesn't disappear. It just loses its claim to being the foundation. Because the surface, it turns out, is not the foundation. The surface is the thinnest outermost layer of something with infinite depth. Here is what's underneath. In the early 20th century, a group of physicists began doing something unprecedented. They stopped studying matter at the scale where it looked solid and familiar, and they went deeper. They went beneath the surface of matter itself, and what they found there should have changed everything about how humanity understands reality. It didn't, because most people stopped at the surface explanation of what they found. But we're not stopping there. What quantum mechanics discovered beneath the surface of solid matter was this. At the most fundamental level, the universe is not made of solid things. It is made of probabilities, of possibilities, of what physicists call a quantum field, a vast interconnected field of potential in which particles don't have fixed locations, fixed states, or fixed properties until something observes them. Read that again, slowly, because the surface explanation of this fact is almost always given, and then immediately walked past, without anyone stopping to notice what it actually means. Particles don't have definite properties until they are observed. This is not a poetic metaphor. This is not a philosophical interpretation of ambiguous data. This is the most rigorously tested, most precisely confirmed finding in the history of experimental science. It is the foundation of every piece of technology built on quantum principles, from the transistors in every computer ever made to the lasers in every fiber optic cable that carries the information you consume every day. The quantum field is real. The probabilistic nature of matter beneath the surface is real. And the role of observation in collapsing that probability into something definite, that is real. So what does this mean? It means the surface version of reality, the one that says the world is made of solid, fixed, material things that exist independently of whether anyone is looking at them, is not the foundation of reality. It is a layer sitting on top of something far stranger, far more fluid, and far more responsive to consciousness than the surface version ever suggested. If this transmission is landing for you, if something in you is already sensing the depth beneath these words, consider subscribing so we can keep going deeper together, and like this video so others who are ready to see beneath the surface can find their way here. But there's a layer beneath that. Because here's what most explanations of quantum mechanics do. They present the finding, they acknowledge how strange it is, and then they quietly contain it. They say, yes, this is true at the quantum scale, at the level of subatomic particles. But at the scale of everyday objects, the classical rules reassert themselves. The quantum strangeness averages out. The table is still solid. The chair is still there when you're not looking at it. So while quantum mechanics is fascinating, it doesn't really change your experience of reality. That is the surface explanation of quantum mechanics. And it sounds reasonable. It sounds like the responsible, scientifically grounded thing to say. But peel back that explanation and look at what's underneath. The boundary between the quantum scale and the classical scale is not a wall. It is not a clear line where the quantum rules stop and the classical rules begin. It is a transition zone, a threshold of complexity, and that threshold is not fixed. It moves depending on what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, and what counts as an observation. More than that, the quantum field doesn't stop existing at the subatomic level. The quantum field is the substrate of everything. Every atom in your body is a quantum system. Every molecule in the air around you is a quantum system. Every electromagnetic signal passing through the space you occupy right now is a quantum phenomenon. The quantum field isn't something that exists at a separate, smaller scale from your everyday reality. It is the layer that your everyday reality is sitting on top of. The table isn't solid at its foundation. It is a quantum field of probability that, at the scale you observe it from, appears solid. The solidity is the surface. The quantum field is what's underneath. And this is where it gets profound. Because if the quantum field is the foundation of everything, and if the quantum field is responsive to observation, then the question of what observation means, what consciousness means, what the relationship is between awareness and the fabric of reality. That question is not a mystical question or a philosophical question or a spiritual question. It is a physics question. It is the deepest physics question there is, and it has not been answered. Not at the surface level, not completely, not yet. But there's a layer beneath that, and that layer is where the ancient wisdom traditions have been waiting for thousands of years. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The quantum field, this vast interconnected substrate of probability and potential that underlies all of physical reality, was discovered by Western science in the early 20th century. The mathematics that describes it was formalized in the 1920s and 1930s. The experimental confirmation of its most counterintuitive predictions, that particles can be entangled across distance, that observation affects outcome, that the universe is fundamentally non-local. These confirmations came in the latter half of the 20th century. That is the timeline of the scientific discovery. But the map of this hidden layer was drawn thousands of years before any of that. Not with instruments, not with particle accelerators or double-slit experiments or quantum optics laboratories. With something else. With sustained, rigorous, disciplined attention turned inward. With consciousness itself used as the instrument of investigation. The Vedic tradition of ancient India described a fundamental substrate of reality called Brahman, a unified field of pure consciousness from which all apparent multiplicity arises. Not a metaphor for the universe. A precise description of the deepest layer of what exists, a layer in which the distinction between observer and observed dissolves, in which all apparently separate things are revealed as expressions of a single underlying field. The Tao Te Ching, written in China approximately 2,500 years ago, describes the Tao as the unnamed source beneath all named things, a field of potential that gives rise to the 10,000 things, that is empty yet inexhaustible, that acts without acting, that shapes without imposing form. The Tao is not a god. It is a description of the layer beneath the surface of reality itself, the Hermetic tradition, preserved in texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and encoded in the ancient Egyptian mystery schools, articulated a principle that has been translated as the all is mind, the universe is mental. Not in the sense that reality is imaginary or that the physical world doesn't exist, in the sense that the fundamental substrate of reality is not matter, but consciousness, and that what appears as physical is a manifestation within that consciousness, rather than something separate from it. The Buddhist concept of sunyata, often translated as emptiness, describes the nature of all phenomena as lacking inherent, independent existence. Things do not exist as solid, fixed, self-contained objects. They arise in dependence upon conditions, upon observation, upon the relational field in which they appear. At their core, phenomena are empty of the solidity and independence we project onto them. What remains when that projection is removed is not nothing. It is the quantum field of pure potential that the phenomena were always arising from. These traditions were not describing the same thing in vague, approximate, metaphorical terms. They were describing the same layer with different vocabularies, different cultural contexts, different methods of investigation. They were mapping the hidden layer of reality that quantum mechanics would later find beneath the surface of matter. And here is what's profound about that convergence. These traditions didn't just describe the layer. They developed technologies for accessing it, practices, methods, disciplines of awareness that allowed a trained consciousness to penetrate the surface of ordinary perception and directly experience the quantum substrate beneath it. Meditation is not relaxation. That is the surface version. Beneath the surface, meditation is a systematic practice for shifting the frequency of awareness from the surface layer of reality to the deeper layers beneath it. It is a technology for lifting the veil from the inside. And this is where the ancient wisdom and the quantum mechanics meet, not just as parallel descriptions, but as complementary tools. The physics tells you what's there beneath the surface. The ancient practices show you how to get there with your awareness, but there's a layer beneath that. Because here is the question that neither the physics nor the ancient traditions can answer alone, and that the two together begin to approach. If the quantum field is the foundation of reality, and if consciousness plays a role in how the quantum field manifests, and if that relationship between consciousness and the field has been mapped by ancient wisdom traditions for thousands of years, then what does that mean for you, right now, in your actual life? What changes when you stop living at the surface and start living from the depth? Let me tell you about Mira. Mira was a woman who had spent 37 years being extraordinarily good at the surface of things. She understood how the world worked, or rather, she understood the surface version of how the world worked, and she had mastered it. She had the right credentials, the right relationships, the right habits, the right answers to the questions people asked her. She was competent, reliable, and completely, quietly, unbearably certain that something was missing. Not missing in her life in any way she could point to, missing beneath her life. Like she was standing on a floor that was solid and well constructed and utterly, completely hollow underneath. She didn't call it that at first. She called it stress. She called it burnout. She called it needing a vacation. She went through the surface explanations, the way you go through a drawer looking for something you can't quite name, picking things up and putting them down, none of them quite right. Then one evening, sitting in a coffee shop, she was reading about the double-slit experiment. Not for any particular reason, she'd stumbled across an article, and she read the description of what happens when you fire electrons through two slits without measuring which slit they go through. They create an interference pattern, the pattern of a wave, as though each electron passes through both slits simultaneously and interferes with itself. And then she read what happens when you add a detector to measure which slit the electron goes through. The interference pattern disappears. The electron behaves like a particle, going through one slit or the other. The act of measurement, the act of observation, changes what the electron does. She sat with that for a long time, not with the physics of it, with the implication of it. The thing she had been calling reality, the solid, fixed, determined world she had been navigating with such competence, was sitting on top of a layer where things existed as waves of probability until consciousness touched them, where the act of looking changed what was there, where nothing was fixed until it was observed. She felt something shift, not dramatically, not like a lightning bolt or a revelation that knocked her off her feet, more like a very slow, very quiet cracking, like the surface of something that had been frozen for a long time beginning to move. She started asking different questions. Not what is the right answer, but what layer am I asking from? Not what should I do, but what is beneath the surface of what I think I should do. Not what is real, but what is real at this layer, and what would I find if I went deeper? What layer has cracking open felt like for you? Was there a moment, a question, a single sentence you read or heard where the surface you'd been standing on suddenly felt less solid than it used to? Drop it in the comments. I want to know what cracked first. Over the following months, Mira began to notice something. The quality of her attention changed. She started to catch herself accepting surface explanations and feeling the pull to go beneath them. She started to notice the difference between reacting from the surface layer of her conditioning and responding from something deeper, something quieter, something that felt less like a programmed response and more like an actual perception. She couldn't have told you exactly what was happening in quantum mechanical terms, but she was doing something that the ancient traditions would have recognized immediately. She was learning to shift the frequency of her awareness. She was beginning to penetrate the veil. And what she found beneath it wasn't chaos or instability or the dissolution of everything she'd known. What she found was that the surface world didn't disappear when she looked beneath it. It became more navigable, because when you can see the layer beneath the surface, You're no longer just reacting to the surface. You're working with the depth. This is what the final phase of the veil lifting looks like. Not fireworks, not cosmic drama, not a sudden supernatural experience that separates you from ordinary life. It looks like a change in the frequency of your awareness, a shift in what layer you're perceiving from, and it changes everything. Now let's go deeper, because there's a specific quality to what's happening right now in this period that makes this conversation different from the same conversation had at any other time. The veil between the surface of reality and the quantum depth beneath it is not a fixed, permanent, unchanging barrier. It is a function of collective awareness. It is a function of what the aggregate of human consciousness is capable of perceiving at any given point in its development. And that capacity is not static. It develops, it deepens, and there are moments in that development, thresholds, inflection points, where the capacity for collective perception makes a jump, where the veil thins dramatically, where what was previously accessible only to trained specialists, whether scientific or contemplative, becomes accessible to a much wider field of awareness. We are at one of those thresholds, not because of cosmic beings or celestial alignments, or the end of some predetermined cycle, because of something far more precise and far more interesting than any of that. Because of the convergence of three things happening simultaneously that have never converged before. The first is the maturation of quantum science to the point where its implications for consciousness, for the nature of reality, for the relationship between observer and observed, can no longer be contained within the specialist community. The findings are out. The implications are being discussed. The veil of scientific abstraction that kept these discoveries from popular understanding is thinning. The second is the unprecedented accessibility of the world's contemplative traditions. For most of human history, the technologies developed by ancient wisdom traditions for penetrating the surface of reality were held within specific lineages, specific cultures, specific institutions. The maps of the hidden layers were not widely distributed. Now, for the first time in history, the collected wisdom of every major tradition is accessible to anyone with the desire to engage it. The ancient maps are available. The third is the development of a global nervous system, a network of interconnected human awareness that allows insights, perceptions, and discoveries to propagate across the collective field with unprecedented speed. When one awareness penetrates a layer of the veil, that penetration doesn't stay isolated. It ripples. It becomes available to other awarenesses tuned to the same frequency. These three things converging at the same moment create conditions for a collective veil lifting that has no historical precedent. And you are here, in this moment, watching this, because some part of your awareness already knows this. Some part of you is already oriented toward the depth, already sensing that the surface isn't all there is, already feeling the pull to go beneath it. That isn't random. That is the resonance of a consciousness that is ready to see what's underneath. But there's a layer beneath that. Because what does it actually mean, in practical, experiential, embodied terms, to penetrate the veil? What does it feel like to shift from surface perception to depth perception? And how do you know when you're doing it versus when you're just thinking about doing it? Here is where the practice lives. And this is not a metaphor. This is a precise, repeatable, verifiable shift in the quality of your awareness that you can do right now. Take whatever you're looking at in this moment. It doesn't matter what it is. A wall, a table, your own hand, whatever is in your field of vision. Now, for a moment, just see it the way you normally see it. The surface version, the object as a solid, fixed, familiar thing. Let yourself see it the way you've always seen it, through the lens of the surface layer of reality. Notice how that feels. Notice the quality of your attention. Notice how the mind immediately categorizes, labels, dismisses. That's a wall. That's a hand. I know what that is. There's nothing more to see here. That is surface perception. That is the layer of awareness that accepts the surface as final. Now do something different. Remember what you know about what's actually there beneath the surface of what you're looking at. Remember that the solid object you're perceiving is, at its quantum foundation, a field of probability, a vast, mostly empty space in which quantum events are occurring at a rate that makes the fastest computer ever built look glacially slow. Remember that the apparent solidity is a product of the electromagnetic forces between atoms, not the atoms themselves being solid. Remember that the boundary between the object and the space around it is far less definite at the quantum level than it appears at the surface level. You don't have to see the quantum field. You're not trying to have a mystical vision. You're just letting your awareness hold both layers simultaneously, the surface appearance and the quantum depth beneath it. Notice what shifts when you do that. For most people, something in the quality of attention changes. The object becomes slightly less fixed, slightly less final. The mind's impulse to categorize and dismiss gets quieter. There is a small but perceptible opening, a crack in the surface through which something else becomes faintly visible. That crack is the veil thinning. And the more you practice holding both layers simultaneously, the surface and the depth, the wider that crack becomes. Not because you're doing something supernatural, because you're training your awareness to perceive at a different frequency. You're expanding the range of what you can see. The ancient contemplatives called this the development of prajna in the Buddhist tradition, of viveka in the Vedantic tradition, of discernment in the Hermetic tradition. The capacity to perceive what is real beneath the surface of what appears, not as a belief, not as a doctrine, as a direct, immediate, experiential knowing. And here is what changes when that capacity develops. You stop being entirely governed by the surface layer of reality. Not because the surface stops existing, but because you're no longer limited to the surface as your only source of information. You begin to have access to the layer beneath it, and the layer beneath the surface of any situation, any relationship, any decision, any experience contains information that the surface layer conceals. This is what the quantum field is, at the level of your lived experience. Not an abstract scientific concept, not a distant cosmological phenomenon. It is the layer of reality beneath the surface of your everyday experience that contains the full probability space of what is possible. It is the layer where things haven't yet collapsed into fixed outcomes, where the wave function of your life hasn't yet been forced into a single definite state. And the act of bringing conscious awareness to that layer, the act of perceiving from the depth rather than just the surface, that act participates in how the probability collapses. That is not mysticism, that is the implication of the observer effect, extended from the laboratory to the life. You are always participating in the collapse of probability into experience. The question is whether you're doing it from the surface layer of conditioned reaction or from the deeper layer of conscious awareness. This is the layer beneath the layer. Let's go deeper still. There is a concept in quantum mechanics called non-locality, and it is, without exaggeration, the most reality-altering finding in the history of science. It is also the finding that has been most consistently explained at the surface level, and then quietly filed away before its implications could fully land. Here is what non-locality means. In 1964, a physicist named John Bell derived a mathematical theorem, now called Bell's theorem, that demonstrated the following. If quantum mechanics is correct in its predictions, then certain correlations between distant particles cannot be explained by any theory that assumes particles have pre-existing definite properties and that influences between them travel no faster than light. In other words, if quantum mechanics is right, then either particles don't have definite properties before they're measured, or the universe allows for instantaneous connections between distant things, or both. In the decades since Bell's theorem was published, experiments have been performed with increasing precision and decreasing loopholes, the most rigorous being the loophole-free Bell tests of 2015 and after, and they have confirmed quantum mechanics. The correlations predicted by quantum mechanics are real, and they cannot be explained by any local realistic theory. What this means, stripped of the technical language, is this. The universe is non-local. There are connections in the fabric of reality that are not bounded by distance. There are correlations between parts of the universe that cannot be explained by anything traveling between them. The universe, at its quantum foundation, is not a collection of separate, isolated, locally interacting things. It is a single, interconnected field in which apparently separate things are expressions of a deeper unity. The veil between you and this fact is the surface assumption of separateness. The surface version of reality presents you as a separate, bounded, isolated individual moving through a world of other separate, bounded, isolated things. That is the surface layer. Beneath it, at the quantum level, the separateness is not fundamental. It is a surface appearance. The underlying field is unified. The underlying field is non-local. The underlying field is one thing expressing itself as many. And the ancient traditions knew this. The Vedantic concept of Indra's net describes reality as an infinite web of jewels, each reflecting all the others, each containing the whole within itself, not as a poetic image, as a precise description of the non-local interconnectedness of all things. The Buddhist concept of dependent origination, the Taoist concept of the 10,000 things arising from the One, the Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above so below, as within so without. These are all descriptions of the non-local unity beneath the surface appearance of separation. The mystics didn't have particle accelerators, but they had something that in some respects is a more direct instrument. They had consciousness itself, trained and refined over decades of disciplined practice, turned inward to investigate the nature of reality from the inside. And what they found consistently across traditions, across cultures, across millennia was the same thing. Beneath the surface of apparent separateness is a unified field, a field of pure awareness, pure potential, pure interconnection that is the actual foundation of what exists. They called it by different names: Brahman, the Tao, the plenum, the ground of being, Sunyata, the One. But they were all pointing at the same layer, the layer beneath the surface of separation. And now, in the 21st century, quantum mechanics has found that layer from the outside, from the direction of experimental physics, with instruments and mathematics and reproducible results. And the two maps, the ancient inner map and the modern outer map, are converging on the same territory. This is what's cracking open. This is the final layer that is becoming visible, not a new belief system, not a new cosmology to replace the old one. The convergence of the most rigorous outer investigation and the most rigorous inner investigation in the history of human consciousness, both pointing at the same hidden layer of reality. And once you see that convergence, you cannot unsee it. The veil is thinning, and what's visible through it changes everything. But there's a layer beneath that, because here is the question that the convergence of quantum physics and ancient wisdom raises, and that most explanations stop just short of answering. If the quantum field is the foundation of reality, and if it is non-local, and if consciousness plays a role in how it manifests, then what is consciousness? Not what does consciousness do. What is it? The surface explanation says consciousness is a product of the brain, a byproduct of neural activity, an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing. The brain generates consciousness the way a generator generates electricity. Take away the brain, take away the consciousness. The brain is the thing, the consciousness is what the brain does. That is the surface version, and it has a very significant problem. The problem is called the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, though the problem itself has been recognized for centuries. The hard problem is this. Even if we could map every single neural process in the brain with perfect precision, even if we knew exactly which neurons fire when you see the color red or feel a pang of grief or have a sudden insight, we would still not have explained why there is something it is like to have those experiences. We would have explained the mechanism without explaining the experience itself. The redness of red, the ache of grief, the quality of insight. These are not explained by neural correlates. They are the thing that needs to be explained, and the neural correlates, however precisely mapped, don't explain them. They describe the surface. They don't reveal what's underneath. This is not a minor gap in our understanding. This is the deepest unsolved problem in all of science and philosophy, and it is unsolved not because we haven't looked hard enough at the surface. It is unsolved because the answer is not at the surface. The answer is in the layer beneath the surface. And here is where the most interesting scientific thinking about consciousness is going. Not toward more detailed maps of neural activity, though those are valuable, toward the possibility that consciousness is not a product of the brain, but a fundamental feature of the universe. Not something the brain generates, but something the brain receives, processes, and localizes, the way a radio receiver doesn't generate the signal, but makes it audible in a specific location. Physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have proposed that consciousness is connected to quantum processes in the brain, specifically in structures called microtubules within neurons, and that these quantum processes connect individual consciousness to the broader quantum field. Their theory, called orchestrated objective reduction, remains controversial, but has never been definitively refuted. Physicist David Bohm proposed a model of reality called the implicate order, in which the apparently separate, solid, classical world we perceive is the explicate order, the unfolded surface, while the quantum field is the implicate order, the enfolded depth from which the surface arises. In Bohm's model, consciousness is not separate from this quantum depth. It is an expression of it. The same implicate order that gives rise to matter gives rise to mind. Physicist Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum theory, said this directly. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. These are not fringe thinkers. These are the architects of the quantum revolution, pointing at the layer beneath the surface of the consciousness as brain product story, pointing at the possibility that consciousness is not what the brain does, but what the universe is. The ancient traditions mapped this layer thousands of years ago. The Vedantic tradition's core teaching is that the individual consciousness, what they call Atman, is not separate from the universal consciousness, what they call Brahman. The apparent separation is Maya, often translated as illusion, but more precisely translated as the veil, the surface appearance of separation that conceals the underlying unity. The Buddhist teaching of Buddha nature holds that consciousness, in its deepest nature, is not a personal possession, but a universal quality that all sentient beings are expressions of. The individual mind is like a wave on the ocean of awareness. The wave is real, but the wave is not separate from the ocean. It is the ocean expressing itself in a particular form at a particular moment. The Hermetic teaching that the universe is mental, that the fundamental substance of reality is consciousness, not matter, is a precise description of what the most advanced thinking in quantum physics is converging toward. The veil between these two maps, the scientific and the ancient, is dissolving, and what becomes visible when it dissolves is a picture of reality in which you are not a separate, isolated, material being moving through an indifferent physical universe. You are a localized expression of a universal consciousness that is the actual foundation of what exists. The quantum field is not something outside you that you interact with. It is what you are made of. It is what you are. And that changes everything about what's possible. Let's go to the deepest layer, because here is what the convergence of quantum mechanics and ancient wisdom ultimately reveals about the nature of your experience, your choices, your life, and what is possible within it. The surface version of your life says you are a fixed entity with a fixed identity, moving through a fixed world, making choices within the constraints of a fixed reality. The past is determined. The future is uncertain but bounded by the laws of cause and effect, operating on fixed material things. What you can do is limited by what the surface layer allows. Beneath that surface, at the quantum level, something completely different is true. At the quantum level, there is no fixed past in the sense of a single, determined sequence of events that could only have happened one way. The past, like the future, exists as a probability distribution until it is observed. This is not a philosophical claim. It is a demonstrated feature of quantum mechanics. In experiments involving quantum erasure and delayed choice, physicists have shown that the apparent past behavior of a quantum system can be retroactively changed by decisions made in the present. The arrow of time at the quantum level is not what it appears to be at the surface. At the quantum level, there is no fixed self in the sense of a permanent, bounded, isolated entity with a fixed set of properties. The self, like all apparent objects, is a pattern of quantum processes that maintains a certain coherence, a certain recognizable structure, but is not a solid, fixed thing. It is a dynamic process. It is, in the language of the ancient traditions, empty of inherent independent existence. It is a wave pattern in the quantum field, not a separate object within it. At the quantum level, the possibilities available to any system are not limited by the surface appearance of what is currently the case. The quantum field contains the full probability space of what is possible, and that probability space is far larger than the surface layer of current conditions suggests. The quantum field is the field of infinite possibility that the ancient traditions called by many names: the Tao, Brahman, the ground of being, the field from which all manifestation arises, and your consciousness, your awareness, your capacity to observe and intend and attend, that is not separate from this field. That is the field, localized and individuated, but not fundamentally separate from the whole. What this means, practically, experientially, in the lived reality of your actual life, is this: you are not limited to the surface of what is currently visible. You are not constrained to the probability space that the surface layer of your current conditions defines, because the surface layer is not the foundation. The quantum field is the foundation, and the quantum field contains possibilities that the surface has not yet expressed. The ancient traditions developed practices for accessing those possibilities, not by bypassing the surface world or denying its reality, but by shifting the frequency of awareness from the surface layer to the depth, and from the depth, participating consciously in how the quantum field collapses into the surface. This is what manifestation actually is, beneath the surface explanation, not wishful thinking, not the law of attraction as a magical vending machine, the actual quantum mechanical process by which conscious observation participates in the collapse of probability into actuality, the process by which awareness, operating from the depth rather than the surface, engages with the quantum field in a way that is not available to awareness operating only at the surface. But here is the critical nuance, and this is the layer that most explanations of manifestation and consciousness and quantum reality miss entirely. The depth is not a tool. It is not a mechanism you master in order to get better outcomes at the surface. The depth is what you are, and the shift from surface to depth is not a technique for improving your surface life. It is a fundamental change in the frequency of your identity, a change in what layer you're perceiving from and living from. When you live from the surface, you are living from the layer of conditioned patterns, of fixed identity, of the probability space defined by your past. The quantum field is still there beneath you, but you're not in contact with it. You're operating from the surface crust that sits on top of it. When you begin to live from the depth, something changes that is not just about outcomes or results or what manifests in your life. What changes is the quality of your experience of being alive. The texture of awareness itself shifts. The world doesn't look different at the surface, but it feels different because you're perceiving it from a different layer. You're perceiving it from the layer where the surface is no longer mistaken for the whole. And from that layer, everything is different. The anxiety that comes from living at the surface, the anxiety of a fixed, isolated self trying to navigate a fixed, indifferent world with limited options and an uncertain future. That anxiety has a specific quality. It is the anxiety of the surface. It is what happens when awareness is confined to the outermost layer and mistakes it for the totality of what exists. When awareness penetrates to the depth, that specific anxiety doesn't dissolve because problems disappear. It dissolves because the self that was experiencing it is recognized as a surface pattern rather than the fundamental reality. And beneath that surface pattern is something that doesn't have that kind of anxiety, something that is in contact with the quantum field, with the ground of infinite possibility, with the unified field that the ancient traditions spent millennia pointing toward. This is what the veil lifting feels like from the inside, not the acquisition of new information, not the adoption of a new belief system, a shift in the frequency of your awareness, a movement from the surface to the depth, a recognition not as a concept but as a direct experience that what you are is not the surface pattern but the depth from which the surface arises. And once you've touched that recognition, even briefly, even partially, you cannot go back to the surface version of yourself as though it were complete. The veil has thinned, the crack is there, the depth is visible through it. What has been revealed cannot be re-hidden. Let me tell you about a moment that a man named Arjun described, not in the language of quantum physics or ancient wisdom, but in the language of ordinary experience. Arjun was a software engineer, precise, analytical, deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured. He had spent years building systems, and he thought about reality the way he thought about code. Inputs, processes, outputs, cause and effect, deterministic logic running on physical hardware. Then his mother died. Not dramatically, not suddenly. She had been ill for 2 years, and the death came at the end of a long, slow diminishment, and Arjun had been present for all of it. He had managed it the way he managed everything, efficiently, practically, with the surface competence that had served him well his entire adult life. And then she was gone, and he found himself sitting in the empty house where she had lived. And something happened that he could not explain in the language of inputs and outputs and deterministic logic. He felt her, not as a ghost, not as a hallucination, as a presence, as something that was not reducible to the physical person who had just ceased to exist, something that was still there in a way that the surface explanation of death, the explanation that said a physical system had stopped functioning and therefore everything that had been that person was gone, could not account for. He sat with that for a long time, and then he started asking questions. Not the questions of grief, not the questions of denial, or bargaining or any of the stages he'd read about. He started asking the physicist's question, what is actually there? He read about quantum mechanics. He read about the hard problem of consciousness. He read about the ancient traditions and their descriptions of consciousness as fundamental. He read about non-locality and entanglement and the quantum field. And something in him that had been locked at the surface for 42 years began to move. Not toward belief. He wasn't becoming a believer in anything. He was becoming a deeper investigator. He was taking the tools of his analytical mind and pointing them not at the surface layer of reality, but at what was underneath it. And what he found over the following years was not a new metaphysics to replace his old one. It was something more interesting than that. It was the direct experiential recognition that the layer he had been living at, the surface layer of a deterministic, materialist, separate self-reality, was not the only layer, was not even the deepest layer, was, in fact, the thinnest outermost layer of something with far more depth. He didn't become less analytical. He became more analytical, but about a wider range of phenomena. He didn't abandon science. He went deeper into it, into the parts of it that the surface explanation had been quietly containing. He didn't adopt a belief in an afterlife. He developed a more sophisticated understanding of what consciousness is, and what the quantum field is, and what the relationship between them might be. An understanding that left the question of what happens to consciousness after death genuinely open in a way that the surface materialist answer had closed prematurely. He told someone once, "I didn't find answers. I found a deeper layer of questions, and somehow that was more stabilizing than any answer I'd had before." That is what the veil lifting looks like. Not the replacement of uncertainty with certainty, the replacement of surface certainty with depth, the recognition that the layer you were certain about was the thinnest layer, and that beneath it is something far more vast, far more interesting, and far more aligned with what you've always, at some level, sensed was there. Is there something you've always known was beneath the surface of your life? Something you sensed but couldn't yet name? A pattern that kept appearing until you finally looked directly at it and it dissolved? Tell me in the comments, what was the hidden layer you finally saw through? Now let's bring this home, to right now, to this moment, to what this means for where you are. The veil between the surface of reality and the quantum depth beneath it is not lifting all at once. It doesn't work that way. It lifts in layers. Each layer you penetrate reveals the next layer beneath it. Each veil you lift shows you that there's another veil behind it. The depth is not a destination you arrive at. It is a direction you move in. And the question is not whether you are ready for the depth. You are here. You are watching this. Something in you is already oriented toward the depth. The question is what you do with that orientation. Here is what the quantum mechanics and the ancient traditions agree on. The shift from surface to depth is not achieved by acquiring more surface knowledge. It is not achieved by reading more, learning more, accumulating more information at the surface level. It is achieved by changing the frequency of your awareness, by training your attention to perceive at a deeper layer. And that training is not complicated. It is not esoteric. It does not require special circumstances or unusual abilities or years of monastic practice, though sustained practice does deepen it. It requires one thing: the willingness to look beneath the surface of your experience rather than accepting the surface as final. That willingness is the practice. Every time you catch yourself accepting a surface explanation and feel the pull to go deeper, and you follow that pull, you are lifting the veil. Every time you sit with a question, rather than rushing to the nearest surface answer, you are penetrating a layer. Every time you bring the quality of attention that holds both the surface and the depth simultaneously. The way you practiced earlier in this transmission, you are training your awareness to perceive from a deeper frequency. The quantum field is not somewhere else. The depth is not a distant location you have to travel to. It is beneath the surface of this moment, of this breath, of this experience of awareness, reading these words and letting them land. The veil is thinning right now, not because of anything external, because your awareness is oriented toward the depth, because you have spent this transmission allowing the surface explanations to be lifted and the deeper layers to become visible, because something in you that was already sensing the depth has been given language, given context, given the scientific and ancient confirmation that what it was sensing was real. You've always sensed there was more beneath the surface. You were right. That feeling that the surface isn't the whole truth, that feeling isn't confusion or instability or the symptom of something wrong with you. It is accurate perception. It is the awareness of a consciousness that is ready to see what's underneath. That has always been ready to see what's underneath. That has been waiting, perhaps without knowing it was waiting, for the veil to thin enough to see through. The veil is thin enough now, and here is what changes when you live from this recognition. When the depth becomes not just a concept you've encountered, but a layer you've actually touched, even briefly, even partially. The surface of your life doesn't change immediately. The circumstances, the relationships, the practical realities of your daily existence, these are surface phenomena, and they change at surface speed, which is slower than depth speed. But your relationship to them changes immediately, because you're no longer confined to the surface layer as your only source of information about what is real and what is possible. When you're living from the surface, your sense of what's possible is defined by the surface conditions, what you can see, what has already happened, what the current circumstances suggest. The probability space available to surface awareness is the probability space defined by the surface layer. When you begin to live from the depth, when you begin to perceive from the layer of the quantum field rather than just the surface, the probability space available to you is the probability space of the quantum field itself, which is not bounded by current surface conditions, which contains possibilities that the surface has not yet expressed, which is, in the language of the ancient traditions, infinite. This is not magical thinking. This is the implication of what quantum mechanics found beneath the surface of matter. The quantum field is the field of infinite possibility, and consciousness is not separate from that field. Consciousness is that field, localized and individuated, but not fundamentally separate from the whole, which means you are not separate from infinite possibility. You are infinite possibility, temporarily localized into a particular pattern at the surface of reality. And the moment your awareness penetrates beneath the surface to the depth, where that is not a belief, but a direct recognition, the surface pattern of your life begins to reorganize. Not because you forced it, because the frequency changed. The ancient traditions called this by many names: liberation, enlightenment, awakening, the dissolution of Maya, the recognition of Brahman, the return to the Tao. These are not descriptions of a supernatural event, They are descriptions of a shift in the frequency of awareness from the surface to the depth, from the layer of conditioned separate self-perception to the layer of the quantum field itself, from the surface of the veil to what's on the other side of it. And what's on the other side of the veil is not a different reality. It is the same reality, seen from a different layer. The surface is still there. The world is still there. The practical realities of your life are still there, but they are no longer mistaken for the whole. They are seen as the surface layer of something with infinite depth. And that seeing changes everything about how you navigate them. Here is the integration. Everything you've encountered in this transmission, the quantum field beneath solid matter, the role of observation in collapsing probability, the non-locality of the universe, the ancient wisdom traditions as maps of the hidden layers, the hard problem of consciousness, pointing toward consciousness as fundamental rather than derivative, the convergence of the outer scientific investigation and the inner contemplative investigation on the same hidden layer of reality. All of this is not a collection of separate ideas. It is a single map, a map of the layers of reality from the surface to the depth, with the quantum field as the layer that connects all the others, the layer that the ancient traditions mapped from the inside and that modern physics is mapping from the outside, the layer that is the actual foundation of what exists, beneath the surface of everything you've been taught to accept as solid, fixed, and final. And you are not separate from this layer. You are an expression of it. A localized, individuated, temporarily surfaced expression of the quantum field that is the foundation of all reality. The veil between you and this recognition is not a permanent barrier, it is a membrane. And membranes dissolve when the awareness on one side of them is ready to see through to the other side. Your awareness is ready. You've been ready. The readiness is why you're here. The surface version of reality will still be there tomorrow. The practical world will still require practical navigation. The surface layer of life will still present its surface challenges and surface joys and surface demands. None of that disappears when the veil thins, but you will navigate it differently. You will navigate it from a different layer, from the layer that knows the surface isn't all there is, that knows beneath every fixed appearance is a quantum field of infinite possibility, that knows the separation you've been perceiving is the surface and the unity is the depth. That knows your consciousness is not a product of the surface world, but a fundamental feature of the quantum field that the surface world is sitting on top of. You are no longer a surface dweller. You see the depth now. And from the depth, the surface looks completely different. Not worse, not better. Different, more navigable, less final. Less like a prison and more like a surface, which is what it is. The thinnest, outermost layer of something with infinite depth. The depth has always been there, beneath every experience you've ever had, beneath every moment you've ever lived, beneath every surface explanation you were ever given, beneath every version of reality that was presented to you as complete. You just hadn't been shown what was underneath. Now you have. If this transmission is worth returning to, Come back to it in a quiet moment, early morning before the surface noise begins, or in the stillness just before sleep, when the deeper layers are most accessible and the veil is thinnest. And if there is someone in your world whose awareness is already oriented toward the depth, someone who has been sensing that the surface isn't everything but hasn't yet found the language for it, share this with them, because the quantum field is non-local. When two awarenesses look through the veil together, the veil thins for both simultaneously. You won't just be giving them access to a layer they couldn't quite reach alone. You will be creating a shared depth between two consciousness fields, and that shared depth strengthens the collective ability to see beneath surface reality in a way that neither of you could generate individually. What has been revealed cannot be re-hidden. The veil is thinner than you thought, and now you can see through it. There is a question that arises when the veil first thins, and it is worth sitting with. The question is not, what do I do with this? That is a surface question. It is asking how to take this depth and apply it at the surface level, which is not wrong, but it is not the deepest question. The deepest question is, who is it that is seeing through the veil? Because here is the layer that everything else in this transmission has been pointing toward. The layer beneath the quantum field. The layer beneath the ancient wisdom. The layer beneath the science and the practice and the parable and the integration. The layer of the one who is aware, not the content of awareness, not what you're aware of. The awareness itself. The pure, contentless, prior to thought, prior to experience, prior to surface quality of simply being aware. That is the deepest layer. That is what the Vedantic tradition calls the witness, what the Buddhist tradition calls Rigpa, or pure awareness, what the Hermetic tradition calls the Nous, the universal mind. What quantum physicists like Planck and Bohm were pointing toward when they said consciousness is fundamental. That awareness is not something you have, it is what you are. Beneath every layer, beneath the surface self, beneath the patterns of conditioning, beneath the quantum processes of the brain, beneath the individual expression. The awareness that is reading these words right now, that is watching the veil thin, that is perceiving the layers as they lift. That awareness is not a product of the layers. It is the layer beneath all layers. It is the ground of being. It is the quantum field at its most fundamental. It is what the ancient traditions spent millennia pointing toward, with every practice, every teaching, every map of the hidden layers. You are not a person who is becoming aware of the depth. You are the depth that is temporarily appearing as a person at the surface. The veil is not between you and the depth. The veil is between the surface pattern you've been identifying with and the depth that you actually are. And when that veil lifts, when that recognition lands, not as a concept but as a direct, immediate lived experience, everything changes. Not at the surface, not immediately, not all at once, but in the frequency, in the quality, in the texture of what it is to be alive. The world is not what it appears to be at the surface. You are not what you appear to be at the surface. The surface is real, but it is the thinnest, outermost layer of something with infinite depth. And you are that depth. You always have been. The veil is what kept you from seeing it, and the veil is cracking. Right now, in this moment, in the quiet that follows these words, feel what shifts when you let that land. Not as a belief, not as a concept to add to your collection of interesting ideas, as a direct recognition, a felt sense, a vibration in the body that says, yes, this is true. I have always known this was true. I have always sensed this was there beneath the surface, and now I am beginning to see it. That recognition is the activation, not of something new, of something that was always there, hidden beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight, waiting for your awareness to look deep enough. Welcome to what was always beneath everything. Now, before we close this layer and move toward integration, there is something worth acknowledging. The experience of the veil thinning is not always comfortable. The surface layer of reality is familiar. It is known. It is the layer where your patterns, your identity, your habits of perception all live. When the veil thins and the depth becomes visible, there is often a period of disorientation, a period where the surface feels less solid than it used to, and the depth is not yet stable ground. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is right. It is the sign of a consciousness that is transitioning between layers, that is in the process of expanding its frequency range, that is learning to hold both the surface and the depth simultaneously. The ancient traditions had a word for this period. In Sanskrit, it is called vairagya, often translated as dispassion or detachment, but more precisely translated as the quality of being no longer entirely captured by the surface, of having seen enough of the depth that the surface can no longer claim your complete allegiance. It is not a negative state. It is a transitional state, the state of a consciousness that is between layers. And the way through it is not to force yourself back to the surface certainty you had before. That certainty was the surface version, and you've seen beneath it. You can't unsee it. The way through is to go deeper, to allow the depth to become more familiar, to practice perceiving from the depth until it becomes not a technique but a frequency, not something you do but something you are. The practices of the ancient traditions, meditation, contemplation, inquiry, the disciplined turning of attention inward toward the layer beneath the surface of thought. These are not religious practices or spiritual practices in the sense of being separate from ordinary life. They are technologies for expanding the frequency range of your awareness, for training your consciousness to perceive from the depth rather than just the surface, for stabilizing the recognition of what you actually are beneath the surface pattern. And they work. Not because they are magical, because they are precise, because they are doing exactly what the quantum mechanics says is possible. They are training the observer, training the consciousness that participates in the collapse of the quantum field into experience to operate from a deeper layer. And when the observer operates from a deeper layer, what collapses into experience is different. This is the technology that the ancient traditions preserved for thousands of years. This is the map they drew before the instruments existed. This is what was hidden beneath the surface of every wisdom tradition, every contemplative lineage, every mystical teaching. The precise, repeatable, verifiable technology for shifting the frequency of awareness from the surface to the depth. And it is available to you, not as a distant possibility, not as something you might achieve after years of effort, as something you can begin right now, in this moment, with the recognition that has already begun to land. The veil is thinner than you think. You've been seeing through it this entire transmission. The depth has been visible in the cracks. And what you've seen through those cracks, even partially, even briefly, is enough to change the direction of your awareness permanently. Not because you've been convinced of a new belief, because you've seen a layer that was always there, and now that you've seen it, you know it's there. And knowing it's there changes what you look for, changes what you're oriented toward, changes the frequency of your attention. That is the final phase. Not a cosmic event, not an external activation. The thinning of the veil between the surface of your awareness and the quantum depth that is your actual foundation. The recognition, however partial, however brief, however incomplete, that the surface is not all there is. That recognition, once it occurs, is irreversible. The veil doesn't thicken again, it only thins further. Each layer you penetrate reveals the next layer beneath it. Each veil you lift shows you what was hidden behind it. The depth keeps deepening. The quantum field keeps revealing more of its nature. The ancient wisdom keeps yielding more of its precision. This is not a destination. It is a direction you are already moving in. A direction that the orientation of your awareness, the fact that you are here, that you have stayed with this transmission to this depth, confirms you have already chosen. You are moving toward the depth. You have been moving toward the depth. And the depth is moving toward you. Because the quantum field is not passive. It is not a static substrate waiting to be observed. It is responsive. It is alive in the sense that matters most, the sense in which awareness is the fundamental nature of what exists. And when a localized awareness, a particular expression of the quantum field that has temporarily taken the form of a person at the surface of reality, when that awareness orients toward the depth responds, the field responds, the veil thins from both sides. This is what the ancient traditions called grace. Not the intervention of a supernatural being, the response of the field to the orientation of the awareness, the quantum field moving toward the consciousness that is moving toward it, the depth opening to the awareness that is opening to the depth. You are in that opening now. And what is opening is not a door to somewhere else. It is the recognition of where you already are, beneath the surface, in the depth, in the quantum field that is the foundation of all reality, in the unified, non-local, probability-rich, consciousness-infused layer of existence that has always been there, beneath everything, waiting for your awareness to look deep enough to see it. You are looking deep enough now. The surface is cracking. The final layer of the veil is thinning. And what's visible through it, what has always been visible through it to the awareness that was ready to see, is not something foreign or strange or separate from you. It is you. It has always been you. Welcome to the depth that was always beneath everything. What you've touched in this transmission, even partially, even in the form of a question rather than a certainty, share it. Not because sharing is a social obligation, but because the quantum field is non-local. Because when you articulate what you've seen, you participate in the collective thinning of the veil. Because there is someone in your world whose awareness is oriented toward the depth and who needs to know that what they're sensing is real, that the surface isn't all there is, that the depth is there and it's accessible and it changes everything. Tell us in the comments what layer shifted for you in this transmission, not what you agreed with or disagreed with. What layer shifted? What crack appeared in the surface? What you saw through it, however briefly, however partially? Because this community is not a collection of people who share the same beliefs. It is a collection of awarenesses that are all oriented in the same direction, toward the depth, away from the surface, into the quantum field that is the foundation of what we all actually are. And when awarenesses oriented in the same direction find each other, something happens that is not reducible to the sum of the individuals. The field responds. The veil thins for all of them simultaneously. The depth becomes more accessible, not just to each individual, but to the collective field of awareness that they constitute together. This is the quantum mechanics of community. This is why the ancient traditions gathered. This is why the transmission continues. The veil is thinning. The depth is visible. And you are no longer looking only at the surface. What was always beneath everything is beginning to show itself. And it was always, only, ever you. Now that you can see the layers beneath the surface of reality, there is something important waiting for you in the video on why not everyone is moving toward the same reality. Because the depth you've just touched is not distributed evenly across the collective field. And understanding why some awarenesses are perceiving an entirely different layer of what's possible will show you exactly where you are in this shift and what opens from here.